Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. In this video I'm going to be looking at all the leader cards available in the OP02 format and give my prediction on how they will impact your local meta. Obviously every local area could have different decks that people will want to play, but I'm basing my predictions based off of potential and I'll do my best to explain my reasons. First, let me explain the categories I've come up with. I wanted to do things a little bit differently than the others I've seen. At the top I have early meta. This will be the decks that I think will be popular early on, mostly due to accessibility. Next, I have later meta, which will have decks that I think will pop up later on when people obtain the cards that they need. Keep in mind that both of these two categories I just went over are 100% the same tier, just with different timelines. These are all going to be popular meta decks. Next, I have the Dark Horse tier. This tier will include decks that I believe will occasionally win local metas if there are people who dedicate the time to learning their matchups and refining their lists. These are decks that I believe could be very good that can go toe-to-toe with the meta decks, but will see less popularity overall. After that, I have the There's Hope tier. This will include decks that I don't think will win many locals, but have something going for them that give them a chance. And lastly, there's the tier Not Much Hope. This tier will include decks that the community will clap for if they win a locals. These decks are either overshadowed by other decks in their color, or to be blunt, just not very good. I didn't want to label this no hope because there's always hope, so if these decks are something that you want to play, please don't be discouraged by anything that I say about them. As everyone says, play what you love. Now that I went over the categories, let's jump into it. First up, we have Zoro. This deck did pretty well in OP01, and it got better in a lot of ways with the second set. This deck can now overwhelm opponents with attackers as low as 1 cost thanks to Makino and Magura boosting their power, so even Searcher Nami is a threat. 1 costs are also searchable by Curly Dedan, so it's really consistent. To top it off, Zoro now has access to 9 cost Whitebeard for the late game as well, who boosts Zoro's power by 2000 on play until the start of your next turn. This deck is definitely going in the early meta tier because it's fairly easy to put together, and it was one of the most popular decks in countries outside the US that received the second set. My local meta already had a lot of Zoro in OP01, so I definitely expect to see this deck, and I think you should be prepared to see it too. Next up, we have Law. Law is going to be another deck to go in the early meta tier. It gets some of the same new cards that will be used in Zoro with Makino and Curly Dedan, and I'm sure there are a lot of Law fans out there that will be playing this deck. I'm not going to let the skill factor sway my opinion. This deck has had some early success already in OP02 format, and I've seen firsthand how dangerous it can still be. After that, we have Red Green Luffy. This leader is one that I'm the most excited to try out, and I want it to work so badly. We now have access to green film cards, and they give this deck a complete makeover. For those who don't know, some of the film cards have on-play effects that allow you to play Straw Hats or film cards from hand. Brook, for example, is a 4 cost that can play 3 cost Straw Hats or film cards from hand. So for 4 Dawn, you get to play a 5k attacker and drop a Rush Zoro or Nico Robin, for example. This deck just looks like it has a lot of potential swarming the board early, and nearly every character in the deck can make use of Red Green Luffy's ability to double swing by resting 4 Dawn. This is definitely a deck that I would consider a dark horse. I think someone can find a list and make this work consistently enough to cause problems at local tournaments. Moving on, we have Odin. Odin's ability lets you trash 1 land of Wano card from your hand to set 2 Dawn active. This deck gets a few new Wano cards to work with, such as the new 1 cost blocker in Kozuki Toki, the 4 cost Yamato that rests a character that costs 6 or less on play, and the 8 cost Odin character himself that's one of the best new cards we receive in set 2. The Wano cards are very good, so I'd say this deck has something going for it, but in my opinion, it's overshadowed by the new Kinemon leader. Getting 2 Dawn to work with is nice, but it comes at the expense of trashing a card from hand, and that's pretty important. This deck falls in the There's Hope tier for me because Kinemon is just such a better leader to me. I just don't think that Odin will be represented enough to win many locals. Next up is Doflamingo. I think this deck was the biggest surprise of set 1. It wasn't a popular deck in the Japanese meta, but it performed really well in North America. Unfortunately, I don't think Dofi gets much to add in set 2, with most of the blue cards being tailored for the Ivankov leader. I think I'm going to put Doflamingo in the There's Hope category. Admittedly, I don't have much experience testing this out against set 2 decks, but it's hard to imagine that it would fall farther than this tier with the success that it had in set 1. Blue Purple Kaido is the next deck, and with this one I'm going to defer to my friend Jordan's advice that it's no good in set 2. He actually played this deck a lot toward the end of set 1 and won a local tournament with the deck, and he already told me that the favorable matchups against red from set 1 are no longer favorable for set 2, so going off of that, I'm going to put Blue Purple Kaido in the not much hope tier. Blue Purple Crocodile, on the other hand, I think there's a little more hope for. Some of the Impelled Down cards can go into that deck. The 6-cost Luffy, for example, might be really good in this deck with his on-play/win attack ability to trash 2 cards and return a 4-cost or less to the owner's hand. Blue Purple Crocodile is more focused on drawing cards, so you can get some use out of that Luffy. The 0-cost event Gum Gum Rain that gives your leader or character 3000 power when you trash a card from hand could also be useful in Blue Purple Crocodile, so I'll say that there's actually hope for this deck. I'm going to be blunt with this one, I don't think there's much hope for King. His leader ability to me always kind of contradicted what Purple likes to do, and Kaido barely got better in set 2 with the Impelled Down card, so King is going into the not much hope tier for me. And now we have the exciting new Whitebeard deck. Whitebeard is later meta to me. I think a lot of people will be excited to try him out as soon as possible, but it might take them a while to get the cards they need and learn how to play the deck. It will definitely rise though, because it's a deck that gives Zoro some problems since it's harder for them to swing over Whitebeard 6k with their smaller bodies. So Zoro is really popular the first few weeks. Expect people to start playing Whitebeard to kind of balance that out. Whitebeard starts out with 6 life, and at the end of each turn you take a life, so it's kind of playing on a timer, but the goal is to make it impossible to get over you for their last swing with counter events and blockers. Whitebeard typically stacks the board with Whitebeard Pirates, and the stage card, Moby Dick, gives them all plus 2000 power if you have 1 or less life. Definitely expect a good bit of Whitebeard at your locals at the set 2 format. Red Black Garp is a deck that I'm not extremely familiar with. Having access to both the red and black card pool seems really good to me, so it has that going for it. The ability says when you attach a Dawn to this leader or a character, give one of your opponent's characters -1 to their cost. On the surface, this seems slightly worse than Smoker's ability, but it works when you attach Dawn to your character, so maybe that's not so bad. I'm actually going to go off the results from outside North America on this one and put this deck in the There's Hope tier, since it didn't seem to have much success, but being the only red-black leader, I'm sure some players in your local area will try to make this work. Kinemon is early meta tier for me. When you have 1 or less characters in play, you may reduce the cost of the next 3-cost or higher land of Wano type character by 1 during this turn. This is really good to get off to fast starts. If you go second, you can play down an Okiku or a Raizo on turn 1, so it's good early on, but it's also good late to play that 8-cost Odin I mentioned for only 7 Dawn. It's just a more efficient leader than Odin, and it is definitely the preferred leader for green, I think. Pretty much all you need from set 2 is the Yamato and Odin, and they aren't hard to come by, so I think players should expect this at their local meta as early as week 1. Blue-Green Sanji. I'm going to catch some heat for this one, I think, since it's a deck that people seem keen on trying out, but I think that Sanji is going to fall into the There's Hope tier. Once per turn, when you play a character without an effect from your hand, if you have 3 or less characters in play, set up to 2 Dawn is active. It's a pretty strong ability, and this is a deck that will flood the board with some powerful vanilla characters. It just comes across as a fun deck to me, and the lack of results I think speak to the deck's flaws. This deck will play a lower count of characters with abilities, and I just think abilities are game changers. I'm really close to putting this in the Dark Horse tier though, but I just think it's slightly below the decks I'm planning to put into that category. Next up is Ivankov. I'm not much of a blue player, but Ivankov definitely interests me. At the end of your turn, if you have 0 cards in hand, you draw 2 cards. They have a lot of strong blue cards in this set that are made for this deck to work. The 1-cost Buggy surges Impelled Down. The 7-cost Ivankov character is pretty nuts because they let you draw until you have 3 cards in hand and play a blue Impelled Down character with a cost of 6 or less, so you can drop that 6-cost Luffy that I mentioned earlier. There's a lot of draw trash in this deck, so it might take a skilled player, but I've seen this deck in action and it's actually pretty solid. It's definitely a deck that can win some of your locals, so I'm actually going to put it in the Dark Horse tier. Like King, Magellan is another disappointing purple leader to me. Gaining 1000 power when a Dawn card is returned from the field to the Dawn deck isn't really that special to me. There's just no reason to play this over Kaido from set 1 in my opinion, so I'm actually going to place this in the not much hope tier. Z, on the other hand, I think is really cool. Purple and black is a neat dual color to have, and I love his ability. When attacking, Don -4, KO up to one of your opponent's characters with a cost of 3 or less. Then, this leader gains 1000 power. I've toyed around with this a bit, and the removal is actually pretty insane. There are so many black cards that reduce cost, and I've popped some of the highest cost characters in the game with this deck. Using purple cards to replenish Don from using the ability works out pretty well in my experience, so it's a deck that I think is going to win some local tournaments if someone dedicates themselves to it. It's a dark horse deck for me. Next, we have the other new hotness from set 2 to go with Whitebeard, and that's Smoker. Smoker is a pretty consistent deck with the ability to neg 1 cost from a character if you have 1 Don attached, and if there is 0 cost in play, this leader gains plus 1000 power. You'll be getting that 1000 power often since so many decks run low cost cards, especially at the beginning of the game, but also because, like I said, there are so many black cards at lower cost. Unlike Z though, this leader makes good use of the amazing 10 cost Kuzan. It gives all of your opponent's characters -5 to their cost during your turn, and also removes a 0 cost in play after factoring in his -5. If you attack with the 4 cost Kuzan first that gives a character -4 when attacking, you can remove a 9 cost from play. If you play 2 10 cost Kuzans, you're removing any character in the game outside of characters that can't be removed by effects, so this deck is pretty crazy. It's pretty good against Kinemon, and a good amount of players I've spoken with at our locals are trying to build this deck. Not many of us have all the cards we need just yet, and this deck is pretty expensive, so this is actually going to go into later meta for me. Expect to see this once people get the cards they need to build the deck because it's very good. This is probably my most anticipated deck from set 2. Uta is up next, and she's going straight into the not much hope tier for me. I don't really expect to see her played much at locals because Zoro is just a much better leader for red. For 1 cost, she gives a character without effects plus 2000 power. You're just 1000 power short attaching that Don manually to one of those characters, so I don't think that it's the strongest ability. Starter deck Luffy, on the other hand, is a dark horse to me. Luffy gained some momentum at the end of set 1, and while the new cards help Zoro a little more, I think if someone were to build a more control style deck with Luffy, it could definitely win some local tournaments still. Vista is a new card from set 2 that can help with this strategy since he KOs a character with 3k power or less as an on-play effect. I don't expect Luffy to be as popular or even as good as Zoro, but it can definitely keep up because the ability to use Rested Dawn is still good, and red is just a good color. Eustace Kid was, in my opinion, the best deck of set 1, and I think it's still really good. Kinemon seems to be a popular choice, but I don't think it's necessarily better. Kid gets access to the new Wano cards just like Odin I mentioned, but it can also make use of the film cards if people decide to build it that way. It might seem strange, but I'm actually going to put this deck into later meta, even though it's a deck that we've already seen succeed. My reasoning is because I don't think it will be played as much as Kinemon early on, but later when Smoker gains some traction, I think Kid is better equipped to handle Smoker since he has that double swing if characters are popped from the board. I wouldn't be surprised if this is still the best deck overall if I'm being honest. Believe it or not, Blue Crocodile is a deck that actually has my interest. Some of the new cards that bounce, such as the 2 cost Arabesque Brick Fist that puts a 4 cost back to the owner's hand, and the 6 cost Luffy that I mentioned, can make for a really annoying deck. And Blue has some of the best counter events in the game, so bouncing characters back to hand while building your own board is a good strategy, I'd say. Still, Blue is just not as good since bouncing is just simply not as good as KOing characters. I think there's hope for it though if someone wants to give it a shot, but I can't say that it's a dark horse deck either because I just don't expect it to be very popular. I think Blue Ivankov is going to be the blue leader that people are going to end up playing. I'm not very high on Kaido personally, but it's still a deck that gets some positive results when it's running hot. The Impel Down cards help a little bit with consistency, giving Kaido a Searcher and Hannibal, but 10-drop Kaido is not as good in set 2 since a lot of characters cannot be KO'd by effects. Kaido is definitely the leader of choice for purple, and Treasuring Life is still a really good ability, so I'm going to put Kaido in the Dark Horse category. It can still hang with the meta decks, but I think it does take a step down from set 1 because it didn't really improve nearly as much as I would have liked. The best addition for Kaido, in my opinion, is probably the Judgment of Hell event card. that for -1 Dawn gives -3k power to up to 2 of your opponent's leader or character cards until the end of the turn. Shanks is okay as a purple leader. I think he's above King and Magellan because the film cards are actually pretty decent, but he's still below Kaido in my opinion. For Dawn -3, Shanks gives all of your film cards plus 2000 power. If you manage to fill your board with the film cards, this is actually a pretty strong ability. You can rest Karina to accelerate Dawn and protect characters with the Union Armado counter event. I don't expect this to be a popular deck, but I'm going to put it in the There's Hope tier since I do think that it's a step above King and Magellan. Lastly, we have Sakazuki. I think Smoker is just a better black leader, so Sakazuki is a little bit disappointing to me. His ability, you rest 3 Dawn and trash a card to KO one of your opponent's characters with a cost of 0. I'm not a big fan of this because for 3 Dawn you can simply play a Kobe who can KO a character with a 3 cost or less by trashing a card, and he gives you a body on board. It might be a simple way of looking at it, I guess, but the argument can be made that Sakazuki always has access to it since he is the leader card. You can use the Kuzan later on, but you still got to make it to that point. I just think that he's overshadowed by Smoker, so he fits the criteria for the not much hope tier, but I think I'm going to put him in the There's Hope tier because he's a new leader card, and there's going to be people that are going to want to play him. I think people like the character as well, so no, not Ace fans, but yeah, he might see some play since he's new, but I just don't expect him to win many locals at all. Alright, so that is my tier list for your local meta. These are just my predictions. Your local meta people might play a lot of blue, so maybe Ivankov will get a lot more wins than, some of these decks up here, or, maybe people like purple, so maybe Kaido will get a lot of local wins, so Kaido can go toe to toe with some of these decks at the top. But yeah, I think that this is pretty solid. Looking at it, you know what, I'm gonna do it just so I don't catch heat for it. And I don't know, it feels out of place in the There's Hope tier because this deck I've seen in action and it's actually pretty scary. So I'm going to do it. I'm going to put Sanji in the Dark Horse tier, and I think that will complete my tier list. I still think that these decks are just a little bit better than Blue-Green Sanji, but at the same time, looking at the list, I think Blue-Green Sanji is a little bit more dangerous than these decks here. So yeah, that's actually going to be, yeah, that looks good. That's the tier list I'm sticking with. Alright, so yeah, like I said, this is just my predictions. Your local meta could shake out differently, but these are the decks that I expect to be the main meta. And then you'll see some of these decks pop up, and then on occasion some of these decks here. And I don't expect to see many of these decks winning, but it says not much hope, not no hope, right? So but yeah, those are just my predictions, so let me know in the comment section below if you agree or disagree. If there's something that you think belongs in a different tier, then, let me know. I like to have a conversation about this. I think that tier lists are supposed to be fun, and I think they're really fun to debate as well, so I would definitely like to have people try to change my opinions on some of these decks, because a lot of them I just don't have experience with, like Red Black Garp. I don't really have much experience with that deck at all, so I could be very wrong on that. Sakazuki might be better than I think it is, and maybe I overrate Law, maybe I overrate Kid, but yeah. So definitely let's start a conversation about this in the comments section below. Give this video a like if you enjoyed what I had to say, and consider subscribing for more One Piece card game content, and I'll see you all on my next video.